Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Jim Malone, filling in for Greta Van Susteren. This week, a look back at the year that was. In U.S. politics, Democrats took over the U.S. House of Representatives, just as investigations over the Russia probe and the president's campaign finances have intensified. We will also take a look at how U.S. foreign policy has changed under President Trump. Also, are the world's two largest economies on a dangerous economic collision course? A look at the trade friction between the U.S. and China. Turning to Africa, we explore a continent in political transition. What events are shaping the African continent as a new year draws close? And finally, mass exodus, how refugees, economic migrants, and illegal immigration are driving political change around the world. We are live on Facebook at Voice of America, and we want your comments and questions. Well, 2018 proved to be a year of change in U.S. politics. Opposition Democrats took back control of the House of Representatives in the November midterm elections, a political shift that could have a profound impact on the next 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency.
Tomorrow will be a new day in America.
Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi celebrating the midterm results that returned the House to Democratic control.
I am Congresswoman-elect Rashida.
Democrats fueled their victory with opposition to President Donald Trump, spurred by a strong turnout of women and progressive voters.
We have affirmed that while this could go down as the darkest time in our history, we won't let it be. And instead, we will be defined by our hopes, not our fears.
Thank you very much. Please.
President Trump now faces the prospect of a stalled legislative agenda and numerous oversight investigations launched by House Democrats.
They got nothing. Zero. You know why? Because there is nothing. But they can play that game, but we can play it better.
The fact is, you do not have the votes in the House.
Nancy, I do. And we need border security. Nancy.
Trump and Democratic leaders have already clashed over funding for his border wall, a preview of the partisan fights to come.
Democrats will certainly use their majority to highlight some differences with Donald Trump and to investigate the Trump administration.
Without full Republican control of Congress, Trump may be looking to cut some deals with Democrats.
At this point, we have not seen Donald Trump really have the ability to work with Democrats to cut any sort of deal in the first 2 years. So Mr. Art of the deal has really fallen short. We'll see if that is possible this time.
But the president will also have to deal with the Russia investigation, which may be moving toward a conclusion in the coming months.
This is a watershed year coming up for President Trump. I mean, he's going to have to confront whatever it is that Robert Mueller says about him or alleges, and I think it's going to be a difficult year for him.
Well, for insight on what the next 2 years might bring, we are joined by two of our best political reporters here at VOA, our Senate correspondent, Michael Bowman, and our congressional correspondent, Catherine Gibson. Thanks to both of you for stopping by and helping us unpack 2018 and take a look ahead. Catherine, there's going to be a big change in the House of Representatives. Democrats taking over in January. Are they ready for this?
Oh, I think they're more than ready for this. And walking around in the halls of Congress these past few weeks, there's a lot of energy among the Democrats. They're talking about all of the different oversight projects they've been champing at the bit to get done, as well as a legislative agenda that covers a lot of government corruption issues. They cannot wait to get started in January.
So, Mike, in the Senate, Republicans will hold their majority, in fact, increase it slightly. But we're going to have divided government now. We've seen this play before. What's your outlook for the year ahead?
Divided indeed, and perhaps more divided than ever. The midterm elections essentially wiped out most of the centrist Democrats, making that caucus on balance more progressive. And three of the notable critics of President Trump on the Republican side will not be in the chamber beginning next year. Jeff Flake and Bob Corker are retiring, and of course, the Senate lost John McCain. So on balance, the Republican caucus is going to be more loyal to President Trump. And when you consider the fact that about a fourth of the Democratic caucus is toying with the idea of running for president, and we're entering a presidential cycle, that's not a great recipe for legislative accomplishment.
That's another complicating factor. But Catherine, how do Democrats hope to balance this idea that they will investigate the president where they think necessary? They will buttress the ongoing Russia probe. We've seen a lot of activities on that recently. And yet kind of deal with some legislative priorities of their own.
Well, Nancy Pelosi has already come out and said that their focus come January is on their legislative agenda, on getting this first package of bills addressing government corruption through. And she said that while there is interest in oversight of President Trump and his business dealings, that's up to the committees. That will come in its own time, and that there needs to be a slow process, a deliberative process, before anybody jumps to any ideas of impeachment.
Mike, we only have a little less than a minute to go here, but in terms of where the president is going to need support, he's going to have to look for the Senate to hold the line, certainly to stop some things that the Democrats want to do. Given the midterm results, are Republicans of a mind to fall in behind Donald Trump as solidly as they have before, do you think?
I suspect that depends on where the Mueller investigation goes. I suspect that depends on where the economy goes. There are many factors in play here, and Donald Trump has a core group of Republican supporters that I think he can count on. And there are more Republicans coming into the year, but it could be a difficult year.
Well, Mike Bowman, Catherine Gibson, thanks so much. We look forward to your reports in the year ahead. Thank you. Turning now to U.S. foreign policy, President Donald Trump fleshed out his America First political doctrine in 2018 with policies aimed at shaking up institutions that have been the cornerstones of the post-Second World War era. Let's look at how U.S. foreign policy has shifted under Donald Trump.
After taking over the U.S. State Department in May, Mike Pompeo pledged to bring pride back to the agency and redefine the president's America First foreign policy. He also told skeptical European audiences that international order in the post-World War II era had failed.
When treaties are broken, the violators must be confronted, and the treaties must be fixed or discarded. Words should mean something.
Among the casualties, the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Agreement on climate change. Faring slightly better, the historic summit in Singapore between President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Despite yielding few results, the meeting itself was seen as an achievement. Not so the president's closed-door meeting in July with Russian President Vladimir Putin, where Mr. Trump's apparent deference to Putin on the issue of Russian meddling in the U.S. elections was seen as a sign of weakness.
Without a doubt, I would describe President Trump's meeting with President Putin in Helsinki as the foreign policy low point, not only of this year, but definitely of the Trump administration so far.
Adding to the administration's troubles, Mr. Trump's failure to hold Saudi leadership accountable for the murder of Washington Post contributor Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi embassy in Turkey. And then, of course, there's China. Observers are bracing for a possible U.S. confrontation in the year ahead as the two countries clash on trade, the South China Sea, and cybersecurity.
So what does the Trump administration consider their outstanding successes in the year just past? Well, to help us take a look at those issues, we're welcomed now by Nike Ching, our State Department correspondent, and again by Michael Bowman, our Senate correspondent, who will help us out as well. Nike, if we look at the year just past, and we had a little bit of a quick rundown there of some of the big issues, but what would be the foreign policy successes the administration is touting?
America intends to lead is the phrase I hear frequently when covering State Department. One of the highlights this administration like to say is the maximum pressure campaign against North Korea. The administration is touting this policy is working For example, it has successfully rallied countries to put pressure on North Korea. We have not seen the missile test and a nuclear weapon test for a while. 3 American hostages were released. And the first summit between Trump and Kim is a step to the right direction, and we can anticipate the second summit in early 2019.
So you would expect more activity on that, and they're going to continue to highlight this as a key part of their strategy going forward.
Exactly.
Very good. We did see this year, Mike, a kind of a rebuke just recently of the administration on Saudi Arabia in the wake of the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And that took everyone not so much by surprise, but the strength of that rebuke was something to know, wasn't it?
I would call it a smackdown, not just of Saudi Arabia in terms of the war in Yemen and the killing of Khashoggi, but also a clear rebuke to the Trump administration and its rationale for backing Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen, as well as some of the equivocation as to who exactly was responsible for the journalist's death. This was a unanimous, the second resolution was passed unanimously, and senators that I've spoken to on the Foreign Relations Committee tell me that they expect further action next year. This is not a one and done. This is going to be a continuing conversation that the Senate has.
And Nike, in the minute or so we have left, what other issues should we keep an eye on? Is Russia going to be a preeminent issue for the administration in 2019? What about Iran, climate change? What are you advising us to keep an eye on?
I think Iran is one of the highlights that this administration wants to focus. The American first foreign policy is a policy that to reflect Americans' leadership, to reflect Washington's position from strength. It's a policy on U.S. terms. So we remember Pompeo has made 12 demands in May when he rolled out the Iran policy. So next year we can anticipate more sanctions continuing.
Very good. Well, Nike Ching, Michael Bowman, thank you so much for joining us as we took a look back at foreign policy. Thank you very much. And now to the somewhat bumpy relations between the world's economic superpowers, the United States and China. Relations between the two countries have grown increasingly tense since June, when Washington slapped new tariffs on Chinese goods, initiating a tit-for-tat trade war. But analysts say at the heart of the economic rivalry is influence and leadership on the global stage.
The U.S. still leads the world on military expenditures. But as Beijing's new hardware shows, China is catching up.
China has increased its military spending for the 29th consecutive year. They are the second largest spender in the world.
President Donald Trump sought to cultivate ties with his Chinese counterpart early in his presidency. But the relationship soured after the U.S. slapped big tariffs on China. As expected, Beijing retaliated with its own tariffs.
The focus, really, of this year has been on trade, and it has become really the litmus test of whether or not this relationship is going to be sound going forward.
Closely tied to trade and defense, Beijing's insistence on its territorial rights to the South China Sea, along with its massive foreign investment strategy called the Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion project that will connect almost 70 countries and solidify Chinese influence on much of the world's population.
What the United States is really worried about is what's China's intent.
Both countries agreed to a 90-day truce on trade at the G20 summit in Argentina. But analysts say the arrest in December of a top Chinese telecommunications executive in Canada for alleged business dealings with Iran is likely to complicate any trade ceasefire between the two countries in 2019.
And to help us sort through this complicated relationship, we are joined live from Beijing on Skype by VOA China Bureau Chief Bill Ide, and here in Washington by our White House correspondent, Patsy Widakuswara. Thank you both for coming in. Patsy, nice to see you. Let's assess at the moment, at the end of the year, where do the U.S. and China stand in terms of their relations? It's been contentious over the year, a lot of focus on trade. How do we look at it at the end of 2018?
It really is like observing a quarreling couple. You know, you have some good weeks, you have some bad weeks. Obviously, the latest one was the speech by President Xi Jinping yesterday, when he very clearly said that no one is going to tell China what to do. That's a very clear signal. But before that, there was a softening. He started buying soybeans. He started reducing tariffs on American cars. And then on the side of the President Trump, there's been a broad push against what they call Chinese state-sponsored hacking. So there's a lot of tumultuous relationship. And in the meantime, the whole world is observing and just wishing that mommy and daddy will stop fighting already.
Well, maybe we should bring in Bill Ide from Beijing and ask them if mommy and daddy are going to stop fighting. Bill, what's the view from Beijing at this point as to where the U.S.-China relationship stands at the moment?
Well, there's a deep uncertainty about the relationship. The situation with Huawei has complicated things a lot more, and that has added to these tensions and the frictions between the two countries. And China is trying, there are those that believe that it's trying to move forward and work through a trade deal with the United States on the terms that the U.S. is asking, and not focus on really as much about what it wants. But really, the speech yesterday by Xi Jinping kind of reiterated the fact that China has its own vision for the world, and it wants that vision to also be accommodated for. And that's probably the biggest problem right now is we have this two competing value systems here that are, going head to head with one another. And, talking about the marriage analogy, there are those that are concerned that we're heading towards a divorce, that we are hearing discussions about a possible new Cold War. And so as they continue to go head to head, we'll see how that works itself out.
Patsy, only a few seconds left, unfortunately, but as you look to 2019, do we look for an improvement? Do we look for more bumpy times ahead?
I think the key will be the relations in trade. That will be the litmus test, certainly, going forward on what's happening. And, again, at this point, we really don't know because, again, the two leaders are also very strong personalities, so a lot also depends on their chemistry. But clearly, from the White House side, there's no sign of letting down or of softening on the relationship to China.
Very good. Lots of interesting times ahead. Thanks very much to Patsy and to Bill Ide in Beijing. Turning our attention now to the African continent, it has been a remarkable year politically for many African countries in 2018. Sitting leaders in South Africa, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe all relinquished power, marking a peaceful and democratic transition of power in countries that have rarely seen such peaceful transitions.
2018 was a year of historic political change in Africa. In Ethiopia, a democratic revolution, an orderly transition of power.
The historic decision of former Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn to voluntarily relinquish power is something that's never happened in Ethiopian history before.
But the new Prime Minister faces deep challenges there after 20 years of hostilities with neighboring Eritrea. Further south in Zimbabwe, the forced resignation of President Robert Mugabe in 2017 paved the way for new elections. But some wonder if the election of President Emerson Mnangagwa, a longtime ally of Mugabe, was really a democratic transition.
I think, as we're seeing in Mozambique and Angola, any transition is good because the new set of rulers typically want to, be their own men and women.
But as a year draws to a close, attention turns to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which holds its elections in December.
If those go passably well, I think this is a huge boost forward because that will be combined, as I see it, with, not so bad trends in Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania.
While Africa watchers say the shift towards democracy is an encouraging sign, many countries such as Congo-Brazzaville, Cameroon, Uganda, and Sudan remain home to some of the longest-serving presidents in Africa, including Equatorial Guinea, where President Teodoro Obiangema Mbasogo has been in power for 40 years.
Joining me now to discuss the year of change in Africa is Salem Solomon of our Africa division. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you. You know, many years ago, I lived in Africa, a couple of different places. And so if you're going to brief me up to date now on what happened in 2018, what would be the highlights? We saw quite a litany there of political change. Is this something that is setting in across the continent? Is it in sort of pockets? How would you describe what's going on?
The biggest transition in Africa has been power changes, transfer of power. In Ethiopia, for example, we saw a grassroots movement led by youth groups that led to a resignation of the prime minister. And we have a young 42-year-old prime minister who has made sweeping changes. One of the biggest changes that we saw is a peace, 20-year peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So there's hope in the Horn of Africa. Another transition that we saw is Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe has seen a transition as well from longtime dictator Robert Mugabe, and now we are seeing changes there. Not changes similar to Ethiopia, but we're seeing transition of power. South Africa also saw a huge change of power with a businessman, Ramaphosa, now taking power and promising economic progress. But we've also seen negative trends that presidents amending constitutions so that they can stay in power. One example is Uganda. Yoweri Museveni has been sitting in power now that he's changed age limit so that he can extend over 75-year his birthday coming up. Let me
move it to quickly a discussion of U.S. policy toward Africa. We saw recently an announcement on a shift. Sum that shift up and give us a sense of the reaction in Africa to that shift.
And so, there's been a major change that literally is counter to what previous administration had in terms of Africa policy. Last week, Security Advisor John Bolton had rolling out major changes that cut budgets on the peacekeeping and others. But what has been very interesting is, and what we have to look forward to is a clear agenda of advancing U.S. interest, but in opposition to other players. So major power like China. China has been very heavily involved in Africa, infrastructure projects on the ground, but other powers like Russia also are going to get pushback from the U.S.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. China is a constant theme here, whether it's Africa or other global issues. Thanks so very much, Salem, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
2018 brought into focus large movements of people across the globe, from the plight of economic migrants from Central America trying to enter across the U.S. border to the mass exodus of refugees fleeing war in the Middle East or famine and political hardship in northern Africa. It's a movement that is sparking resentment and unrest in many parts of the world, not to mention a political platform for growing populist and anti-immigrant rhetoric.
15 months into his first term, President Trump's signature campaign promise remains unfulfilled.
Building a great wall on the southern border.
With funding for his wall stalled in Congress, the president seized on reports of a caravan of Central American migrants headed for the U.S. border to sound the alarm, claiming that liberal policies were hindering U.S. Border Patrol agents from doing their job. The president called up the National Guard and instituted a zero-tolerance policy that separated children from their families at the border.
Take care of these children in a good and decent and proper way.
But leaked audio obtained by ProPublica revealing the tormented cries of children inside a detention facility sparked nationwide outrage. From New York, where a caravan of border-bound grandmothers gathered in protest, to Texas residents living near the border. But as the November midterm elections neared, the president took to calling the Central American migrant caravans an invasion.
You think we're letting that caravan come into this country? You can forget it.
I don't believe in an open border. I have children myself, so, I have to look for their safety.
But some 9,500 kilometers east, across the Atlantic Ocean, a similar movement of people was also generating outrage. In Spain, with the arrival in 2018 of more than 60,000 economic migrants and refugees. And in Italy, where far right-wing protesters and anti-fascist counter-demonstrators clashed outside a church center housing Eritrean refugees. All told, the European Commission reports more than 134,000 refugees and migrants made their way to European ports and cities in 2018, many traveling by boat across the Mediterranean Sea, where many of them perished or drowned. Analysts say it's a global exodus that may be shaping populist, anti-immigrant sentiments and political rhetoric around the world.
So what's behind the mass exodus we are seeing around the world, and how are governments dealing with it? To help us answer those questions, we are joined by VOA Europe correspondent Henry Ridgwell from our London studio. And here in Washington, I'm happy to be joined by our VOA News Center immigration reporter, Alini Barros. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The images from the southern border, some of which we just saw, as we assess at the end of the year, are we in a sort of stalemate situation? Where do you see the big picture at the moment?
Well, the reality is that people are still going to come, right? We have this management way that the Trump administration has been doing in slowing down people crossing the border and crossing between ports of entries, which makes people crossing between ports of entry, right? The difference between what's happening here at the border, it's a bit complicated because people are just running away from hunger and threats of violence, right? We've seen reports where people say no to gangs and they keep going after them. Right. And they have no other choice but to run away.
So the likelihood we're going to see that is likely to continue a bit.
It is. Historically, January is a slow month,
right.
But we'll see what's going to happen with all that's happening in South Dakota.
Let me broaden it out and bring in Henry into the discussion from London. All the upheaval we've been seeing in Europe over the recent months, and in which you've been covering, the strains of populism, concerns about immigration, migration. I mean, how do you assess the year just passed, Henry?
I think what we've seen is the delayed impact of the migrant crisis that occurred in Europe in 2015 and 2016, and we've seen that impact in the ballot box of several European countries, to mention Hungary, of course, and the crushing victory for Viktor Orban there with his right-wing anti-immigrant party. In Italy, with the coalition government there taking a very strong anti-immigrant line, blocking those rescue boats who are picking up the migrants in the Mediterranean. But as Aileen was saying, those migrants are still going to come, and many people use the analogy of squeezing a balloon. If you try and stop them coming to Italy, they're going to find other routes. And as we've seen, they've started to arrive in greater numbers in Spain now as well, that being the #1 destination for migrants. And we're seeing the beginnings, perhaps, of a minor political impact there with the rise of a far-right party called Vox there, something which people thought would never be seen in Spain after their history of fascism in the 20th century. Even as far afield as Sweden, we've seen impact of the ballot box with the Sweden Democrats winning seats in parliament. They have roots in the neo-Nazi movement. So in 2017, really the narrative in Europe was that the election of the French president, Emmanuel Macron, had stopped populism, anti-immigrant, right-wing politics in its tracks. But in 2018, we've seen those gates open again, and we've seen many populist movements jumping on that anti-immigrant message to secure, normally successfully, seats in parliament or presidencies, and that's having a huge impact on policy across the continent.
All right, Henry Ridgwell in London, thank you so much. Alini, thank you for joining us. A shortened segment, but we appreciate the effort there. Before we leave you, a moment to recognize and reflect on the journalists around the world who put their lives at risk every day just to do their jobs. And as we saw this year in the case of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, journalists sometimes pay the ultimate price in their efforts to speak truth to power. So as we look back on 2018, we remember those journalists who gave their lives in the cause of reporting the truth, no matter the cost.